Here are 5 short books which, though they may be small, pack a mighty punch. Let's start off, of course, with the book that inspired this list, the brand new Mammoth by Eva Baltasar. This was translated from the Catalan into English by Julia Sanchez, and this review copy was sent to me by And Other Stories. I was and remain a massive fan of Baltasar's Boulder, which was published a few years ago, and I've talked about it quite a few times on this channel, and now we have Mammoth. Mammoth, like Boulder, is a sapphic novel, but it is very, very different. Boulder is at its core about a relationship, about the delicate and difficult intricacies of romantic love. Boulder explores what happens when two people fall in love through no fault of their own, and yet ultimately want very, very different things out of a life built by two people for those two people. Mammoth, however, is a 100-page novella about a young lesbian who is untethered from life. She's anxious, and yet she's attempting something that could be called hedonism. She is wandering, detached, and trying to understand herself better. When the novel begins, she's in her mid-20s, and she's working as a researcher at a university. In the very first chapter, she's at a party, and she attempts to seduce a man because she so desperately wants to be a mother. She wants to carry and have a child, and the easiest way to do that is to seduce a guy, sleep with him, and use him to have the baby that she wants. It is deeply problematic and very, very unhealthy, and it doesn't work. And after that, she quits her job and she starts moving from place to place and job to job. She tries out lots of different jobs and stays in lots of different temporary accommodations until she ends up at a farm in the countryside. Everyone who passes through this farm and the village nearby is a tourist or a hiker from a big city. And like with any short novel that I really want to talk about, it's difficult to go into too much detail because it's only 100 pages long. Spoiling it is something that would come way too easily. But what's far more important than the events of the novel is the character herself and the themes of the book and what she comes to represent and how we bond with her, etc., etc. She really feels like a product of now. She's a young queer woman who feels lost and confused. She has an idea of what she wants. This obsession with having a kid is something that she latches onto. And yet she is gay, and throughout the novel she shows no real interest in other women because those women can't give her this one thing she's grown to obsess over. She sacrifices so much of who she is, who she was, who she could be in order to fulfill this need. But it goes far beyond that as well because so much of the novel isn't about that obsession. It just kind of sits there like an elephant in the room while she tries on different skins, has a go at different jobs, moves from place to place. She's very lonely and isolated, and yet there are multiple characters in the book that she comes to know. She works with them, she befriends them awkwardly. She dabbles in so many different things in order to find who and what she is. It's a novel about the kind of juxtaposition of freedom and pressure, and it's something that I massively related to. As someone who used to be a nomad and used to be pretty hedonistic, and as someone who is self-employed, there was a lot that I saw in her. And also the fact that she kind of ignores her queerness, focusing on other things and trying to find herself in other ways, that also massively spoke to me. Mammoth is not an easy book. It gets harder as it goes, so fair warning. But it's definitely a book for now. For millennials and younger who feel detached and untethered and unsure and confused, excited yet anxious, hedonistic and yet guilty almost. I felt so much of me in her, and it is remarkable how much happens and how much connection you can feel in 100 pages. Then we have one of my all-time favourite novels from one of my all-time favourite authors. This is The Wind That Lays Waste by Selva Almada. I've talked about her a lot on this channel, but in case you don't know, she is one of the great modern Argentinian authors, and this particular novel was translated by Chris Andrews. The Wind That Lays Waste is a little over 100 pages long, and it very much reads like a play script. It is wonderfully theatrical, and it calls to mind something like Waiting for Godot. This little novel tells the story of a traveling priest who is driving through the wilderness of Argentina with his daughter, and suddenly their car breaks down. Luckily for them, a little bit down the road is a garage with a mechanic who works there. This mechanic has an apprentice, and he says it's going to take a few days to fix up the car. During those few days, the traveling priest and his daughter stay with the mechanic and his apprentice, and the two men continue to butt heads over theology. The mechanic is an atheist, and the two of them continue to become more and more aggressive and opinionated and stubborn in the way that they argue about religion and theology. And what makes things even more intriguing is the fact that the preacher's daughter is very tempted by what the mechanic is saying, and the mechanic's apprentice is lured over to religion by the priest. This whole novel takes place between four characters in an isolated location, and so it really feels like a play. They are just locked into this space and doing nothing but conversing and getting increasingly angry and irate with each other. It's a book about religion, but it's also a book about masculinity, about strong, toxic male figures dominating conversation, making everything about them and their beliefs and their opinions, shutting down every other conversation, every other voice in the room. And even though, as I said, it is about religion and the conversations they have are arguably interesting, it really just feels at times like a pissing contest. And it reminds us of how men often converse with other men, where male conversations often feel more like arguments and a battle for supremacy, rather than an attempt to actually make friends or have a healthy conversation. I really adore this book for so many reasons. As an atheist who, at least in the past, has kind of trodden that line between apathetic atheism and anti-theism, I do find the conversations between these men really, really fascinating. But more importantly, I am so won over by how Selva Almada explores the conversation dynamics between dominant and arrogant men. She is a wonder. I was lucky enough to interview her a few weeks ago at Topping & Co in Edinburgh. Meeting one of my great heroes and interviewing her in front of an audience was one of the best moments of my adult life. I love her so much, and this is one of my absolute favourite novels. This is Cannibals by Shinya Tanaka. It was translated from Japanese into English by Kalau Almani, and it was published by Honford Star. Cannibals is just 80 pages long, and like every other book on this list, it absolutely packs a wild punch. As it goes on, Cannibals feels more and more like a Lynchian fever dream, but at the beginning, we have a pretty grounded setup. Our protagonist is a young man whose father is abusive. His mother left because of that abuse. They all live in a very, very small town next to a river in rural Japan, and he lives with his father while his mother sits at the edge of the river just over the other side every single day, and she uses a special appendage because she lost one of her hands to descale fish that she's caught. She sits there and does this all day, every day. And her son occasionally walks by and has conversations with her. It's a little bit strange, and it feels very Twin Peaks. But the big kind of narrative and thematic thrust of the book is the fact that this boy is very afraid of ending up like his father. The idea that the temptation to be abusive is genetic. He's got himself a girlfriend. His father also has a girlfriend who currently lives with them. He sees his father abuse this new girlfriend, and he feels as though it's only a matter of time before he becomes like his dad. And it's very frustrating to see this level of self-awareness and yet to also see that prophecy come true. If you know that you could end up a certain way, you go the other way, especially if you're afraid of that outcome. and yet he doesn't, he can't. It's difficult to go into without spoiling things, but as I said, the book becomes very, very surreal. Lynchian is the word to use here. If you're a fan of Twin Peaks or anything else that Lynch has done, you'll appreciate the way that this book is written and the way that things are conveyed, especially character interactions. And as I said, for an 80-page book, it's very complex. It took me a minute to even consider the responsibilities of the mother who abandoned her son to an abusive man while sitting almost outside, viewable through their upstairs window, just descaling fish and taking no responsibility for her son, who has now grown up in a cloud of fear that he'll end up just like his dad. It's really terrifying stuff. Cannibals is an alluring and strange thing. I found it so horribly immersive, and I say horribly because of the themes that it touches on. It's a difficult thing to read, and ultimately very, very rewarding if you can stomach it, because there are a lot of things in here that are very triggering. This is Minor Detail by Palestinian author Adanian Shibli. It was translated from the Arabic into English by Elizabeth Jacquet. It is a little over 100 pages long, and it is separated into 2 different narratives, each one taking up half the book. The first narrative takes place in 1949, a year after the Nakba, and it's told from the perspective of an Israeli soldier who captures, has his way with, kills and buries a young Palestinian woman in the desert. And in the second half, we follow a Palestinian writer who has become annoyed by a narrative that she heard on the radio, and she wants to travel around, do some research, visit libraries, talk to people, gather up evidence and information in order to set the record straight and have the Palestinian voice be heard. Minor Detail, it goes without saying, is a very, very difficult book to read, especially right now. But from where I'm standing, that makes it all the more important to read, because we need to be reading Palestinian voices. We need to be engaging with Palestinian narratives and art now more than ever. Minor Detail is unflinchingly raw. It tells difficult truths, and it begs the reader to pay attention to what's happening. I am enormously impressed by the intelligence and the passion with which these stories are conveyed. How the author has dug deep down into truth, pulls out sickening stories, and delivers them into your lap for you to try to digest. And the book ends in a very, very brutal and heartbreaking way. I think I need to at least warn you of that. Minor Detail, in many ways, is the book that everybody should be reading right now this year. As I said, it is 100 pages long. It will rip your heart out, but that is the bare minimum that we can be doing right now. And finally, at about 180 pages, Stregga by Joanna Leica Holm is the longest book on this list. This was translated from the Swedish by Saskia Vogel, and it is a fantastic piece of surrealist gothic fiction. It tells the story of a young woman who spends a long summer working at a hotel in a mountainous region in Sweden called Stregga. At first, everything is very, very quiet. We spend time with these girls as they get to know each other, working at this hotel, spending their free time doing whatever they like, but eventually the hotel gets busier and busier, and when it gets busier, one of the girls disappears. And so there is a mystery element to this thing, but it's also scary. I didn't expect that when I first read Stregga. As I got into it, I began feeling on edge. I was almost getting pins and needles from the sheer level of tension. There are ghostly, haunting moments in this book that really made my skin crawl, set my teeth on edge. I felt paranoid, like I wanted to check behind me. There is a real haunting quality to this book, and I really didn't expect that. I knew it was going to be surreal and strange and kind of gothic in a claustrophobic, isolated way, but it genuinely terrified me in certain moments. I still don't know if I'd call it a horror novel. It's just a very, very effective modern gothic novel, and gothic fiction is frightening. Which now makes me wonder what the distinction between gothic and horror often is. I love both, and they often bleed into each other. I don't know. Conversation for a different day. Stregga's one of those novels where if you've heard of it, if you've read it, you are a massive, massive fan. But so many people haven't heard of it at all. If you've read it, you think it's perfect. Otherwise, you haven't read it. I can't imagine meeting someone who read it and went, yeah, that was okay. And I know someone will say that in the comments now, of course. But Strega really is a powerful force. Once again, we have a book that could be described as Lynchian in the ways that characters interact with each other and behave, and also in the claustrophobic, repetitive nature of the book. There's a delightful surrealism to it. In moments and in ways, it kind of reminds me of The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro, but much, much shorter than that book. And like I said, in certain moments, it is scary, but it is really, really brilliant. I would call it hypnotic. There you go, those are 3 really short, fantastic books, all under 200 pages long, most of them around 100 pages long, that all pack an absolute wallop. I hope you enjoyed and subscribe for books.